welcome to the Iowa Grazing Academy. These are the recordings from the 5 online sessions that were held in July of 2026. If you have any questions, please contact Shelby Gress at the email address listed on the slide. Thank you and enjoy these sessions.
So I'm going to start us off today just by kind of kicking off a discussion on forage species for Iowa pastures. And with 25 minutes, we'll only just get a taste of it, but I will share a few resources at the end so that anybody who wants to learn more about some of the forages that are out there can look into some of these in more depth. And so our discussion will be starting out with talking about life cycles of our forage species and then some basic classifications of different forage species that we might use here in the state. And then we'll talk about some key species that we use and then finish up by just sharing some of those resources so that you can look into some of the ones that I talked about today and then go learn about some more forages. And so to start with, uh, plant life cycles are probably going to be the primary way that we think about classifying forages, right? And so depending on our forage systems that we're producing, somebody may be interested in annual forages, but most of the time we're going to be looking toward more perennial type forages. And so annual forages are going to be those that will complete their life cycle in less than 1 year. And so we may have what are called winter annuals that will generally germinate sometime in the late summer or early fall. They will produce some growth in the fall, depending on, more or less depending on what the weather is like. They will go dormant over the winter, and then the following spring they will resume their growth and then produce seed prior to the end of the summer or the following fall. And so all of that happens within about 12 calendar months or less, some of which can happen on very short time frames. Biennial species are going to be those that will complete their life cycle over more than 1 year, but they will survive typically fewer than 3 years. And so that's going to be similar to, oh shoot, I should mention the summer annuals, of course. So I mentioned winter annuals. So summer annuals are going to do the same thing that winter annuals do, but they will germinate in the spring and produce seed in the fall. Sorry, biennials will take all or part of 2 years to produce their seed and finish their growth cycle. And so typically they'll germinate sometime in the spring or early summer of the first year. They will produce growth that most of the growing season, and then they will go dormant in the fall. In the following spring, when they release themselves from dormancy and they start their growth pattern, they will be on a track to produce seed at some point later in that summer. And so I always think of weeds as our sort of relative species that many people understand. And so, like, our annuals might be something like a water hemp or a mare's tail, whereas our biennials might be more like a musk thistle. And so you can kind of think of the life cycles like that. And then a perennial is going to be a plant that will survive multiple years, sometimes many years, right? We have perennial plants that can survive for 40, 50 plus years potentially. Oftentimes they will survive somewhere between maybe 5 to 10 years or so. And so perennials will survive for more than 3 years often. They will go dormant over the winter and they'll resume growth the following spring. Some perennials only produce seed once, and many perennials will flower and produce seed many times over that multi-year life cycle. And so forage grasses are probably the most common pasture species that we think about, and they can be broken up further in lots of different ways. And so we might think about our warm season forage grasses versus our cool season forage grasses. We may think of them as annuals versus our perennials, right? So some people may be interested in annual forages like sorghum sudan grass or millets versus our perennial species, more like our tall fescues and our orchard grasses. And then we can also think of them as sod formers versus our more bunch type grasses. And so that's really important when we are thinking about our perennial type systems, that it's really nice to have a variety of things that will form sods and things that will be bunch grasses. And so those sod formers will help fill in open space in our pastures. And so there's a lot of common species that we use, but the great majority of the ones that we use here in Iowa are going to be cool season perennials. And so those will be things like our brome grasses, our Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, the fescues that we might grow here, and then things like Timothy as well. And grasses, there's a wide variety of them, and the cool season grasses are there at the top. So these are just a few examples. This was a graph from the University of Missouri that shows smooth brome grass, tall fescue, and orchard grass. And you can see those cool season species. They perform very well in the spring. They reduce their production, right? They slow down when we get warm during the summer, and then they'll pick that production up again in the fall. And how quickly they pick that production back up again and how much production you get depends a lot on the species. And then we have our warm season grasses below: switchgrass, eastern gamma, big blue stem, and Indian grass. And that shows how you get kind of a shorter season of production with those grasses, but they could fill in a niche at a different time of year when our cool season perennials aren't performing as well. And so the same is true for some of the other species we'll talk about, but this is a nice graphical representation of that. So forage legumes would be kind of the next most common thing behind our grasses. They can be annuals, potentially biennials or perennials. They typically will produce very strong tap roots, and so they'll have a primary tap root, and then they'll have a number of secondary roots, and those are typically going to be the secondary new roots that are nodulated by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. There are very few species that we use as forage legumes that will produce stolons or rhizomes, but there are a couple of them. And so those will be ones that beyond that taproot are able to spread. Most of them will only produce that taproot. And then some common species might be things like alfalfa, red clover, bird's foot trefoil, and then white or ladino clover. And then my final kind of category is non-legume forbs. And so this would be sort of anything else that's not a legume that isn't forming those rhizobium relationships in the soil. And so these are going to be herbaceous broadleaf plants. They're not grasses, and they don't nodulate and form relationships in the soil. They're not members of the Fabaceae family. They can be annual, biennial, or perennials. And I sort of think of these like a lot of our sort of cover crop species, right? There's a huge variety in species that could be fed or could be grown for forage purposes, depending on your location, the time of year, what grazing needs you have. And the most common species are going to be things that are like short-lived, like turnips, radishes, and forage rapes, some of our brassicas, and then some of our longer-lived species like chicory or plantain. And so that image right there is of a forage chicory plot. And so you can see how leafy that is. And so I want to just spend the rest of the time really going through a few key forage species that we use here in Iowa and a few of their sort of advantages or disadvantages to how we might use them in grazing. And so the first one is going to be smooth brome grass. This is by far one of the most common perennial grasses here in Iowa. If you look in, virtually any road ditch across the state, you will find smooth brome grass. And so it is a sod-forming cool season perennial. And so it produces rhizomes or lateral stems below ground that help it form basically a mat that can be very competitive and help keep weeds down. It can be very versatile. It's got strong drought tolerance because it produces a really deep root system. It's got really good winter hardiness. Obviously, we don't have road ditches that are, dying out of their smooth brome grass every year, and smooth brome grass can be used for a wide variety of purposes. It also does well mixed with legumes. One thing about most of these grasses is they're going to perform a lot better if we give them nitrogen. And so obviously these taller cool season grasses are going to do a lot better if we give them nitrogen. And so some of the detriments of smooth brome, one is that its quality declines pretty rapidly. That happens with a lot of grasses, but its quality does decline really rapidly as it starts to produce seed heads. It can be a bit slower to establish, and so oftentimes if people are establishing it here in Iowa, if they were just trying to establish smooth bromgrass, they might seed it with a kind of a companion species to help sort of push down weed pressure and give it a chance to get established. And this species is going to have pretty poor tolerance to low grazing. And so it's going to do best in like a rotated grazing kind of environment where it's allowed the opportunity to rest and it's not grazed down super low. Kentucky bluegrass would be my next example. Kentucky bluegrass is another one of our sod-forming cool season perennials. Basically, every lawn in the state of Iowa is a Kentucky bluegrass lawn. So you could see that these are kind of the reliable species that we use here in Iowa. Kentucky blue shows up a lot and performs really well in overgrazed pastures because it's going to tolerate very close, very short, frequent grazing often. And one of the best things about Kentucky bluegrass is it's incredibly high quality grass. But to its detriment, of course, it's going to be very low yielding. If you think of the grass in your lawn, it doesn't grow very tall. And so forage varieties of Kentucky bluegrass can typically get maybe 12 to 15 inches tall or so, but they're relatively short grasses compared with our taller cool season species. It is going to have very low summer production, quite a bit lower than most of our other cool season species because it will go dormant at even a hint of really hot, dry conditions. So the next week to 2 weeks here in Iowa, it looks like we're expecting very hot temperatures and very low likelihood of rainfall. And I expect that we will see a lot of dormant or near dormant Kentucky bluegrass. And then this is another species that can be very slow to establish. Orchard grass is my next one. This is a relatively easy to establish grass. It's cool season. It's going to be a tall, cool season bunch grass that'll be a perennial. It's quite versatile. It's used in haying. It can be used in pastures. It's got a quite high quality content to it. And then this is going to be a species that will tolerate the more frequent cutting than other tall, cool season grasses. And so that's one reason that it's often used in systems with alfalfa. Um, it's very high yielding. And then similar to smooth brome grass, it will have a pretty rapid decline in quality as it matures. And then relatively speaking, it's typically not quite as winter hardy or drought tolerant as smooth brome is going to be. And then one other thing that I notice with orchard grass is this seems to be the grass that I most commonly will see rust on. And so just like with a lot of these species, you want to be careful when you're choosing specific varieties, looking for things that are going to be more tolerant to the most common problems. And so for orchard grass, I always encourage people to look for varieties that will have good rust tolerance. Uh, tall, Tall fescue is our next grass. This one is you either kind of love it or you hate it. It's extremely resilient. And so something that I notice is that after the several years of drought that we had from kind of 2020 to 2024, I see a lot more tall fescue in Iowa. And that's mostly a function of the fact that it's the grass that survived the best through a lot of those kind of crappy conditions that we had where we were spending a lot of our summer very dry and very hot, and it's really tolerant of those kinds of conditions. It can be quite high yielding, but it's generally not going to be considered quite as high quality feed as other tall, cool season grasses. And so if you're somebody with a pasture that's mixed with tall fescue and other species, I often will see the livestock, if they're given a choice, they're going to kind of avoid the tall fescue unless they're given sort of forced to feed on the fescue. One of the biggest issues with tall fescue is that if you didn't intentionally go out and seed and know that you seeded a variety that either was an endophyte free or had a novel endophyte tall fescue, you probably have the good old Kentucky 31 tall fescue, which does have a toxic endophyte that can be quite hazardous to livestock. Um, and then there are endophyte free varieties. They're generally not considered quite as resilient as the ones that contain the endophyte, and there all are also new novel endophyte varieties available for the tall fescue. Moving on to perennial warm season grasses, and so these are much less common to be grown here in Iowa, but I think it's important to mention them because they could hold a really useful place, I think, in some of our grazing systems if people have the wherewithal to get them established. So switchgrass, big blue stem, and Indian grass are probably the three most common that somebody might consider. But there are other species that you could grow. There's a whole host of warm season perennials that will survive and do pretty well here in Iowa. They are going to be highly productive during the summer months, right? Very high yielding, very fast growing. They regrow from basal tillers on the plant. Most of these are going to be considered bunch grasses, but virtually all of them do produce short, very slow growing rhizomes. And so they will spread some. The bunch itself will get larger, but they're typically pretty slow to grow. They are difficult to establish. If anybody's ever tried to establish a CRP, you know that it takes really 2 to 3 good years to get a really nice stand of those warm season perennials. Um, there's a pretty short window of high quality, so that would be another challenge to managing these, is that you really have to be out there and be ready to feed it when it's in good shape, and then you also have to be able to give it really good rest. And so it's best not to try to graze them during their seeding year. They're focusing very much on putting roots on, and they're going to benefit quite a lot from a rest period every fall. Switchgrass, of these, switchgrass is probably the easiest to establish. It's probably the least expensive, but on the scale of palatability, it may be less palatable than bluestem and Indian grass. But man, their early growth is quite leafy. It can be highly palatable and quite high in nutrition if you manage it well. I want to move on and talk about a few legumes, but I just want to again sort of reiterate and cover a couple things about legumes in general. So legumes, when we seed them into pastures or into new ground where that species hasn't been grown in a long time, we need to make sure that that seed is inoculated with the appropriate rhizobium bacteria in order to make those species the most successful they can be. They're also going to vary quite a bit in their tolerance to poor drainage, low pH, low fertility. And so if you're trying to grow a legume, you really want to make sure that you are pairing the right legume with the right grazing situation and knowing a lot about your soil fertility and drainage characteristics of those fields is going to be really important. If you're used to fertilizing with nitrogen, if you are trying to increase the legume percent in your pasture, adding nitrogen is going to benefit the grass, and it's certainly not going to benefit the legume, and it may be quite harmful to it. And so generally, especially spring nitrogen is going to favor your grasses, and it will make your legumes suffer. But these overall, they pair really well with cool season grasses for mixed pastures. And then they also have a varying ability to cause bloat, which I'll talk about just a little bit with each species. And so we'll cover 3 species here, the first of which is going to be red clover. Again, a cool season bunch type perennial. It's not going to spread by rhizomes or stolons. Medium red clover is generally the type that's preferred for grazing because it's going to regrow better after grazing versus the mammoth red clover. There's numerous improved varieties available, including one that's called the Q medium red clover, developed at the University of Florida. That's actually a non-GMO variety bred to tolerate applications at 2,4-D. And so there is some pretty interesting breeding work happening with some of these species. Red clover is very easy to establish. A lot of people will just frost seed it into established pastures, and it does a really good job of establishing if it's got enough space to do so. They're relatively short-lived. About 2 years is what you can often expect from these, but again, they're really easy to reseed if you want them. Red clover doesn't like wet feet, and then overgrazing and nitrogen fertilization is going to shorten that life even further on red clover typically. Alfalfa is a perennial cool season bunch legume, very high quality. It maintains its production a lot better during that kind of summer time frame and during droughty conditions because of its substantial taproot that it produces. It does really well with tall season grass or tall grasses and mixtures, so those cool season perennials we talked about. And there's a lot more breeding that has gone on in alfalfa than many of these other species, and so you can get improved varieties. Um, Detriments of alfalfa, right? Poorly adapted for continuous grazing, doesn't tolerate having wet feed. It does not like poorly drained soils. You absolutely have to have a higher pH than you do for virtually any other forage. So you need to be in that kind of 6.9, 7 pH, or maybe even a little bit higher. But at a minimum, we like to see a 6.9 pH. And so that means if you want alfalfa, you have to plan ahead of time to get that pH changed. And this, along with the red clover, have the potential to cause bloat. And so somebody who knows more about livestock can talk about how best to manage that, but certainly not grazing it by itself would help a lot. Bird's foot trefoil is my last legume. This is going to be it can be a really long-lived perennial legume. And so bird's foot trefoil I have the flowers here because you may recognize them because every time our roadsides are mowed in the summer, you can see bird's foot trefoil take off. And so this is kind of an interesting species. It does not cause bloat. It's one of the only legumes I think that is not really prone to causing bloat. It's actually more productive in summer heat, which is really neat because it's going to take off when a lot of our other species are going into that kind of slump period. And it's quite tolerant of low fertility, low pH, wetter soils, a kind of a greater range of conditions than some of our other legumes. And there are some disease-resistant varieties available because that is typically one of the most prevalent issues with it. Um, about 60% of the species' annual forage production comes between the months of June and August. So that's pretty cool because those are pretty low times for other species. Our detriments are that it is quite slow to establish, like a lot of these other species, and it definitely requires fall rest and careful grazing management. And so, something that's important with bird's foot is that it's actually a good idea to allow periodic self-seeding. And so, letting it get big enough that it can actually produce some mature seed and drop those can be helpful. You really want to make sure that you have controlled grazing on this and are not allowing for livestock to totally defoliate plants because it will just completely eliminate them from the system. On to just a couple of our non-legume forbs. So brassicas are one example, right? Most of these are going to be cool season annuals. They are going to have high forage quality. They're going to be quick to establish and graze. They need relatively good drainage typically. Uh, Certainly, if somebody set a bunch of livestock out on a field that looked like this picture from Albert Lee, that could absolutely cause some health issues with those livestock. And so you need to be careful about making sure that these types of species don't take up too much of their diet. And then brassicas, most are not going to survive Iowa winters. So they're going to be a relatively short-lived forage option that somebody could perhaps harvest or plant in late summer and feed in the fall, and then it'll winter kill, or they could seed it in the very early spring, and they could use it for later spring feeding. Chicory is kind of my last one. So this is a perennial cool season forb, and this is not the same as the weedy chicory that we have in basically every road ditch in Iowa. It's actually a very high quality forage that can be quite similar to cool season grasses and alfalfa. It tolerates acid conditions and droughty conditions really well once it's established, and it can be seeded relatively easily into an existing sod too. Um, Varieties of chicory will vary in their winter hardiness. It will require nitrogen, similar to how grass requires nitrogen. So maybe 100+ pounds of nitrogen per year for optimal production. But you also have to balance that with the fact that adding nitrogen is going to very quickly send these into their reproductive growth. And so you have to have your livestock ready to do that feeding as it's sort of setting off in the spring to try and produce a seed head. And so it could require mowing or a shortened grazing interval during that kind of mid-spring to late spring timeframe when it's starting to really produce a lot of growth. And so just to reiterate, that's not the same as the weedy forage and or weedy chicory. And this is a really common species that we have, especially in north central Iowa, invading pastures right now. And so it's important, I think, to distinguish between the two of those. So just my last notes here. There are a ton of other species that I didn't cover. I didn't even touch on like cool season annuals, like our small grains or warm season annuals that you could use for short-term forage options. But there's a lot more information about those and the species that I talked about available online. And so my last little comment here before I give you your resources is, can we eat the weeds? And weeds in pastures can be, just as palatable and available for livestock to graze on as the desirable forage that you want there. But some of them can be really bad for your livestock. And so it's important to know what weeds you have out in your pastures and whether or not you can tolerate them. And so you could see on this slide, yellow foxtail in the upper left can be actually a really good forage, highly palatable early in its growth cycle, but once it starts to produce those seed heads, obviously its palatability goes down quite a lot, and it can even cause some health issues with livestock trying to graze on it. Versus things with spines like the buffalo burr and the thistle, those are probably never going to be tolerable at any level in a pasture. And so I want to kind of leave you with this before I give you your resources, which is can we eat the weeds? Maybe. Should we eat the weeds? In some cases, it's up to you. So on the left-hand side of this slide, I have a buckhorn plantain, which it can be okay palatability. It could be okay forage. It's not toxic to livestock, but it takes up a lot of real estate on the ground, right? It produces that big basal rosetta leaves. It's a perennial, so it'll keep coming back kind of bigger every year. And it produces a ton of seed. And so one of the challenges with the buckhorn plantain is it takes up a lot of real estate and it produces a ton of seed, but you don't get a lot of forage out of it. And so it's one that some people might tolerate and other people might want to get rid of versus the wild parsnip on the right side of this slide, which is, in virtually any scenario, it's a no-go. Can livestock eat it? Are they going to be poisoned by it? No, they will not be poisoned, but all parts of that plant contain a toxin that creates phytosensitivity when livestock are exposed to the sun. And so we certainly see cases of burns on lighter skinned livestock or on kind of the muzzle of horses that have been feeding on this species. And so we would consider that one undesirable in all cases. And so my final slide here is just a comment that we've got a ton of resources on our extension store website. So that's where that QR code will take you, where you can look at what forage resources we have available. And then there's a lot of other resources available online. There's a lot of universities that still do forage production research and do variety testing and other things. And so I would encourage you to look for those for more information. And then finally, if you need a field agronomist in your area to help you out with your pasture, this is the map of the state. So I'm right here in central Iowa, but we've got field agronomists everywhere that can help with any issues that you might have.